Okay, thanks for waiting, everybody. Pretty much just turned 10 o'clock, I think, so we'll get started. We are obviously recording the session, so we'll be able to send a copy of the slide deck and the recording to you after the session. You'll have been notified ahead of the session that we've got everybody's sort of cameras on, turned off and microphones on mute, just for GDPR reasons, really. But if you would like to pose any questions, please use the Q&A or the chat function. And what we'll do is we'll kind of pause throughout and try and answer questions as we go. And we should have plenty of time left at the end to answer any questions that we've kind of parked. There might be some stuff that we need to take offline. If that's the case, we'll be clear about that and let you know. So let's get started then. So you're joined today by myself. So I'm Jake Tween. I'm Director of Apprenticeships, DSW. I think I've probably met or spoken to most of the people in attendance. But for those of you who don't know me, I oversee the endpoint assessment part of DSW's business, essentially. So managing the product development teams and the quality function and working really closely with training providers and employers to make sure that there's clarity over the processes and that we take on board your feedback and that we provide the best possible experiences for your apprentices and hopefully they come away with a good outcome as well. So I'm joined today by my colleague, Kayleigh Watson, who is a product owner who looks after the HR standards within our portfolio, and I'll let Kayleigh introduce herself now.
Hi, I'm Kayleigh. So as Jake said, I'm product owner for the HR standards. So it's my responsibility to ensure that we are delivering these assessments in line with all the conditions, in line with the assessment plan, and also to give apprentices the best experience they can have at EPA.
Brilliant, thank you. I think everybody's pretty much familiar with DSW, so I'll just go through this bit really quickly. So we've been delivering endpoint assessments since its inception, to be honest. So HR is part of a broad portfolio that we've got of 36 standards, and that's grown on a almost weekly basis. And we now work with in excess of 150 different training providers on HR and other standards from level 2 right the way through to level 7. So we've got a real breadth of experience in terms of the different types of challenges and demands that different types of training providers and employers have. Been delivering a lot of endpoint assessment over the last few years. And at any given time, we're delivering EPA to well over 2,000 employers as well. So really broad portfolio that we've got there. So I'll just start then by giving you a very brief overview of the agenda. I think Kayleigh's probably likely to cover off most of it. I have the joy of doing the grading part, which is probably the most technical and contentious bit, so I'll do my best to explain all that in the clearest terms. I do expect there probably will be a lot of queries, and there's no such thing as a silly question. This is brand new to everybody. It is fairly complex, I'll be honest, but we've tried to explain it in the simplest terms, and we're more than happy to answer any questions, not just now, but on an ongoing basis. So when you're delivering this, and you might have apprentices, you know, not at EPA yet, and you get to it in a month's time and think, could do with a refresher, drop us an email, pick up the phone, and we'll be happy to help you. Okay, so in terms of the agenda, so Kayleigh will kick off with a bit of background. So why have we made the changes and what's influenced that? She'll go through a timeline, so that's a new updated feature within the toolkits, and we have a visual representation of that on the slides, and that's just to give real clarity to yourselves and to your apprentices what the actual EPA timeline looks like in terms of the different components and what needs to be submitted when. Then we'll look at each of the individual assessment methods and the specific changes that have been made, and how we are seeking to bring further clarity to apprentices about how that all works. So we'll look at the project plan, we'll look at the consultative project itself, and we'll also look in depth at the professional discussion component. And then Kayleigh will pass over to me and I'll talk you through the grading. So that's the grading for each of the individual methods and the overall grading for the standard. Like I say, that has been significantly changed, and that's to bring it in line with kind of off-course requirements and to standardise with the EPOs. And then finally, Kayleigh will take you through the updated assessment record and feedback that apprentices get. And like I say, we should have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. I think we're booked in for 90 minutes, which should be more than enough. I'm going to now hand over to Kayleigh just to give you a bit of that background.
Thanks, Jake. So for the background and why these changes were made, so this was part of an off-qual standardisation activity that we were a part of. So we have worked very closely with Ofqual in conjunction with this. We did come up with the assessment approach, the grading approach, and also the timeline to implement this and presented that to Ofqual. We have considered the apprentice at each stage. So, for example, with the implementation, we wanted to ensure there was plenty of time for everyone to get their heads around this and not just kind of do it with a month's notice, because we appreciate there have been quite a lot of big changes with this one. So we wanted to give, you know, as much notice as possible on it. As the assessment plans for level 3 and level 5 are very similar, we have also updated level 3 to align with level 5. And because of how close those similarities are, this webinar will cover the changes made for level 3 and level 5 as well. For anyone who's not aware, level 3 was actually launched last thing yesterday. Our operations team will be in contact with everyone just to confirm those changes, but the toolkit is now live and available to download from EPA Pro. So the changes that we've made is we've provided some further guidance on appendices. We've got some further guidance on what is and what is not included in that word count, just to provide absolute clarity there for everybody. We've got an infographic showing the endpoint assessment timeline. So that's a visual representation of the EPA period, and we'll be looking at that more closely in a second. We've amended all of our embedded documents in line with the changes that we've made to the grading and also to the amplification. We've also made some improvements to the project plan template as well. And we have got feedback on a lot of people about this project plan, because we understand that this is essentially what supports success in that project by having a well thought out plan. We've provided some clarification that the consultative project can be written in either first or third person. And then we've also amended the graded approach in line with the current guidance that we've received from Ofqual, including writing some distinction criteria. So on the screen now, we can see the infographic. So this provides the visual representation of endpoint assessment. So on the left-hand side, we can see what's required at Gateway. So we've got the Gateway Declaration, the proof of maths and English, and also proof of professional qualification for our level 5s. In the next kind of column, we've got planning meeting. So this is just to ensure that when you come in to that planning meeting, you are prepared for what dates will be booked in. We have said that the endpoint assessment period will typically be 4 months. That is typically. Sometimes it might be a little bit longer, sometimes it might be a little bit shorter. So for the consultative project, that project plan will be reviewed and feedback will be given as well. The apprentice will then have a maximum of 12 weeks from Gateway to complete and submit their consultative project. So that is a slight change from the last version. So what we do recommend is that with that project plan, if the apprentice can have that ready for Gateway, and then essentially as soon as they come through Gateway, they're ready to go with endpoint assessment. And then we have the professional discussion, which will take place once the apprentice has completed and passed that consultative project. So we're now going to have a look a little bit more in depth at that project plan. So we have a little bit of an overview of the project plan here, and also just some hints and tips to support apprentices with success. So as I said before, we do strongly recommend that the project plan is completed and ready to be submitted to the endpoint assessor at Gateway. Again, just so that they are ready to go as soon as they come through Gateway. It's really important to start with the problem or the issue. So what we do see sometimes is that the apprentice will essentially start with the end in mind, when really we should be looking at what is the problem, what's the problem statement, what is the issue, and then clearly stating those aims and objectives. So then through the project, they are looking for the root cause of that issue and what can be put in place to address that. So the apprentice, the training provider, and the employer should be working together to help the apprentice to identify a suitable project, and also to pay close attention to the passing the distinction criteria to ensure that that project is going to have the scope to meet that criteria in full. It's also just a reminder that we do have the project guidance document. This is something that's been designed to support the apprentice, basically from step 1, from firstly identifying that project, to then writing that project plan, carrying out their project activity, and then writing up their consultative project report. So in this version, the project plans will be reviewed as they are now. Feedback will be provided as it is now, but we won't be rejecting any more project plans. So the apprentice will submit their plan, they will receive feedback on that, and then they'll be able to start straight away with their consultative project.
Thanks, Kayleigh. Just to add to that, so we assess a lot of standards that have got projects in them, like I say, right away from level 2 up to level 7. So we've got a lot of experience of this. And I think that the part I would really pick out there actually for apprentices and the skills coaches and the line managers actually is around paying close attention to the pass and distinction criteria. So the best thing to do is to have that naturally occurring project with a real business value. But it's worth the apprentice themselves, with support from the line manager and or their coach, to almost rag rate those pass and distinction criteria, because inevitably with any project there'll be certain criteria that it absolutely, you know, is clearly going to meet, but there might be some that are a little bit more tenuous, for want of a better term. So I think that rag rating exercise is good, in terms of, right, okay, well, these ones are nailed on. There are a couple of criteria here that you might have to really hone in on and be really clear to the assessor as to how what you've done meets those particular criteria. And when you get the feedback on the project plan from the independent assessor, if that independent assessor thinks, okay, there are a couple of outcomes there, a couple of criteria that's not clear to me how the project's relevant to them or how the apprentice is going to generate that evidence, they will make that clear in that feedback. So that's in particular that part of the feedback I would strongly recommend that you hone in on, and just give a bit of a steer to the apprentice of, look, when you're writing this up, make sure that you're really crystal clear in your own mind and in what you've written down as to how what you're presenting clearly meets those criteria in particular.
Yep, so we have created a new project plan template, so it does look a little bit different, but we have created an area within that template where the apprentice can rag rate each of those learning outcomes. As Jake said, we've also got an area within that project plan where the apprentice can plan out how they're going to essentially carry out their project. So they might wish to do that kind of week 1, I'm going to be doing this, week 2, I'm going to be doing this, or do that more broadly into months, but essentially just to support them with planning out when they're going to be carrying out that project activity.
Super.
So onto the consultative project. So the apprentices will have 12 weeks from Gateway to complete their consultative project and to submit it for assessment. It can be written in first or third person, but it's really important to avoid the use of we or the company. We are kind of seeing this creeping a little bit more at the moment. So it's just a reminder that the endpoint assessor needs to clearly see the apprentice contribution. So it is the apprentice who's being assessed, so we need to see their competence and what they've done. It's also important to pay attention to the word count and what is and is not included. We have had a few cases where apprentices have gone over the word count, and unfortunately that has led to them not meeting certain outcomes because we've just not been able to include some of the content there. Structure is very important to bear in mind as well. We do see some projects that are quite heavy on knowledge. Now we are aware there's a lot of knowledge outcomes in this project. However, what we do see sometimes is essentially half of the word count will be used up on knowledge and it becomes a project of 2 halves. So it kind of becomes a very heavy knowledge statement in part 1, and then part 2 is the actual project activity. For appendices, it's important to make sure that anything that is included in those appendices is referred to within the report, because learning outcomes cannot be demonstrated through appendices alone. So, for example, if an apprentice has taken some data, they've done some analysis on that data, they may wish to do some commentary and their analysis within the written project report. They may then wish to put in that redacted raw data into their appendices to support what they're saying in that report. And then I've had some feedback from our endpoint assessors as well, who've commented that the best projects actually group the learning outcomes together and then demonstrate them through specific sections. So what some apprentices do is they will, for example, take a paragraph and they will look to demonstrate one learning outcome through that one paragraph. And that can make things a little bit disjointed. So the reports that we see that kind of flow really nicely and are quite well structured, really well put together, and also give more opportunity for holistic assessment, is, for example, an apprentice will have a data analysis section. And within that section, throughout it, then they might demonstrate CK3, CK5, CK7, and CS11. And then include that raw data as an appendices and then refer that within the report. It's also important as well to ensure that the learning outcomes are demonstrated in full within that report, so that your appendices are simply just your supporting evidence to essentially show what that apprentice has done. So then on to the professional discussion. So looking at the data for professional discussions, apprentices do perform very, very well in it. We can see that, you know, behind the scenes, there's a lot of preparation going on there. Apprentices are coming in well prepared, they're confident, and they know exactly what to expect. We do have some more questions available within the toolkit as well to support that preparation. And just a reminder as well that responses can come from any point of their apprenticeship. So they don't need to be based on the consultative project, but they must use specific examples to support their responses. We also recommend as well using the STAR approach to ensure that the endpoint assessor has the full background and context for that specific example. And then just a reminder as well that notes can be taken into the discussion. So that's up to 2 sides of A4 paper, and that can include the learning outcomes if the apprentice wishes to take those in.
Okay, thanks very much, Kayleigh. So I'll take over just for this section, which is to talk you through the grading. Like I said at the beginning, it's significantly different to the way that we graded these standards before. It's been done in response to kind of consultation with Ofqual and cross EPA standardization, just to make sure that it's consistent across the sector. So I'll do my best to explain it in the simplest terms, but please do shout out if you've got any questions. Use that chat function in the Q&A, or alternatively, if you want to leave a question until the end, we can pick it up once we've run through. There's not that much more of the presentation left, to be honest. It's the grading section, and then Kayleigh will finish off a little bit about the assessment record and feedback for apprentices. So previously, the approach that we took to the grading was that we would mark each of the kind of individual learning outcomes as met or not met, and then we would apply the sort of high-level holistic distinction criteria that feature in the assessment plan. Through our conversations with Ofqual, what we've agreed to do is to take what's essentially a more granular approach to the grading, whereby what we do is we grade each of the individual learning outcomes separately, and then we use that score to get an aggregated kind of percentage, which determines the grade that the apprentice gets for each method, and therefore at the end, the grade that they get is a final grade for their EPA. So if we start with what's on the screen there now, so this is the simplified version of it, really, just to show how the marks are distributed, because the complexity, I guess, comes in that the apprentice obviously has the option to carry over up to 3 learning outcomes. So they might say, okay, there's 1, 2, or 3 learning outcomes that I don't intend to do in my project, which I'm going to carry over into the professional discussion. So what that means in essence is that we need to have a dynamic grading model, which varies depending on how many, if any, of those outcomes are being carried over. So the table that you can see on your screen there shows how many marks are available within the project, depending on whether the apprentice is carrying over no learning outcomes or 1 or 2 or 3. So if we start on the left-hand side of that, so say if the apprentice says, okay, I am going to carry 3 learning outcomes over into my professional discussion, that means we're only assessing 17 learning outcomes in that project. The maximum amount of marks that you can get for each learning outcome is 5. So you can see at the top there, if you exceed a learning outcome, you'll get 5. So in simple terms, 5 times 17 learning outcomes, the maximum amount of marks that an apprentice can get is 85 if they've chosen to carry the 3 over. So I should have said that in very simple terms, when we're looking at each individual learning outcome and the assessor's grading the work, there are 4 possible grades for each outcome. So the assessor might say it's not met, it clearly doesn't link to the learning outcome, in which case they'll mark it as not met, and there are 0 marks allocated to that learning outcome. If the assessor determines that it's partially met, so actually there's some evidence in there, but it doesn't quite cover the learning outcome in full, they'll mark it as partially met. If they believe it's met, yeah, great, okay, all of the evidence is there. It hasn't quite exceeded the learning outcome, and we've given those definitions now within the toolkit as to what's met and what's exceeded. They'll mark it as met, but if they think, yeah, you've met that exceeded definition that's in the toolkit, they'll mark that learning outcome as exceeded, and they'll give 5 points for that learning outcome. Now, I wouldn't get hung up on the marks there. So at the top of the screen in the bullet points, you can see you can get 0, 1, 3, or 5 marks. I would kind of, to all intents and purposes, ignore them. The marks are purely there so that in the background, we're able to make a grading calculation to work out what the overall grade is. What you really need to focus on is the not met, partially met, and exceeds, and that simplifies it massively. So just to recap then on the table at the bottom, so if the apprentices decided they want to carry 3 learning outcomes over, that leaves 17 learning outcomes to be assessed in the project, and the maximum score that they can get for the project would be 85 marks. So that represents 100% in that circumstance. If they're carrying 2 learning outcomes over, the maximum number of marks that you can get would be 90. So if they've exceeded every single learning outcome, they'll get 90, and that's 100%. If they choose only to carry 1 over, the maximum number of marks they can get in their project is 95. And if they decide they're not going to carry any over and they're going to attempt every single outcome in the project, that means we're assessing 20 learning outcomes. A maximum 5 marks per outcome gives you 100 marks. Okay, so at the bottom end of that scale, if you're carrying 3 over, the maximum number of marks you can get in your project is 85. If you're not carrying any over, there are more outcomes to assess, and therefore the maximum is 100. Okay, so the next table looks slightly more complicated, but it's the same information, but just with a bit more sort of meat on the bones, I guess. So on the first couple of rows there, you've got the same information that we've just looked at. So if we start with scenario 1, where there were 3 learning outcomes carried over, we know that the maximum number of marks that the apprentice can score in their project is 85. Okay, and then what we've done is we've worked out the percentage. So the assessment plan tells us that they need to score 60% in order to pass that assessment method. So 60% of 85 is 51. So in essence, the apprentice needs to score a minimum of 51 in order to pass that method if they've chosen to carry 3 over. Now, there is an additional rule at play here. So not only does the apprentice need to hit 60%, but they also need to have met every single learning outcome as a minimum of met, so a minimum of 3. So what that means is there is feasibly a scenario where an apprentice scores more than 51 in their project. However, they don't pass because there are 1 or more of the learning outcomes that are deemed as not met or partially met. So 2 rules there that you need to remember. One is every learning outcome being assessed needs to score a 3 as a minimum, and the overall marks need to be at 60%. So 60% is 51 marks if they're carrying 3 over. If we move on to the next column, 60% is 54 marks. If they've carried 2 learning outcomes over, then that goes up to 57 marks. And then if they're not carrying any over and everything's being assessed in their project, they'll need to score 60 marks in order to pass. Now, I mentioned that they need to hit a 3 in everything. So if the apprentices hit a 3 in everything, regardless of how many they've carried over, they will automatically hit those minimum pass thresholds. So if they've hit a 3 in everything, you don't need to worry about how many marks they've got because they will automatically have got the required amount. So the row below that tells you how many marks the apprentice needs in order to get a distinction. So again, there are 2 rules that we have to apply here. So one is that they score 85% or more in that method. And the other is that they still need to have hit everything at a minimum of 3. So they need to have hit the pass criteria and a certain number of outcomes need to be exceeded. So that tells you the number of marks available. And to simplify that, what we've done is in the bottom row there, we've made it really clear how many learning outcomes need to be met and exceeded in order for the apprentice to get a distinction for that particular assessment method. So for the project, if we look at the first column, the bottom row, if the apprentice has met the pass criteria, so they've hit everything at a 3, great, they've passed. If they also hit 11 or more learning outcomes at exceeded, they will get a distinction for that particular assessment method. So if we flip to the far end of that, if they've carried no learning outcomes over, so all 20 learning outcomes are being assessed in a project, and they've hit the pass criteria, in order to get a distinction on their project, they need to hit 13 or more of those 20 learning outcomes at a 5 at an exceeded to get the distinction. So hopefully that makes sense. Like I say, there are no stupid questions. It's very different than what we did before. It's pretty complicated compared to a lot of assessment plans, but this is the way that Ofqual want us to do it. So we do have to kind of apply those kind of two rulings that you hit the minimum threshold and you hit a percentage. But hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, but do shout out if not. Now, I understand sometimes people don't want to ask questions in this forum, so if you want to contact us separately and have a chat through it, that's not a problem at all. More than happy to do that. Okay. And now we're on to the professional discussion. So it's a similar picture, really. What we've done is we've calculated the maximum number of marks that are available for the professional discussion, and that varies depending on whether or not the apprentice has carried over any learning outcomes. We've worked out the number of marks needed to hit the 60% to pass. And again, they need to hit everything at a minimum of 3 in order to pass. And if they have hit everything at the minimum of 3, they automatically will hit the number of marks that they need, so you don't need to worry about that. And then to get a distinction, obviously they need to hit everything at a 3, and then they need to also get 85% of the total marks available. And again, we've massively simplified that. So if you focus purely on the bottom row there, this tells you what they need to do to get a distinction. So if they haven't carried any learning outcomes over, there are only 9 learning outcomes to be assessed in the PD. So if they've met them all and they've exceeded 6 or more of the 9, they will get a distinction. So at the other end of that scale, if they've carried 3 learning outcomes over, what that means is there aren't 9 to cover in the PD. There are 12. Okay, so the number of learning outcomes that they meet at a distinction obviously increases because there are more learning outcomes overall being assessed in this method. So if they're not carrying any over, 9 will be assessed and they need to meet 6 at exceeded. If they've carried 12 over, if they've carried 3 over, 12 will be assessed and they need to meet 8 of those at exceeded, and that represents the 85% or more that they need. So finally, on the grading, what we've done, I'll give you an overview of how that works on an EPA level, so for the final grade. But we've also worked up a couple of examples just to demonstrate what I've just talked about and hopefully bring it to life for you a little bit more. So in order to get a pass overall, the apprentice needs to achieve a minimum of a pass in both of the assessment methods. And in order to gain a distinction, they need to get a distinction in both assessment methods. So if they pass one and get a distinction in the other, they'll get a pass overall. If the apprentice fails one of the assessment methods, they can resit or retake, but their overall grade will then be capped at a pass. So they can't fail a method and then retake it and get an overall distinction. Okay, so before I hand you back to Kayleigh, I'll give you those couple of examples that I talked about. So apprentice 1, if we focus purely on the consultative project, just to try and keep it simple, this apprentice has decided that they're going to carry 2 learning outcomes over into the professional discussion. So the independent assessors graded the project. Okay, they've said there aren't any learning outcomes that are not met. There's 1 learning outcome that was partially met. 12 learning outcomes were met. Okay, and 5 learning outcomes were exceeded. So the overall score that apprentice has got comes out at 69%. So you would think, great, that's a pass because it's above 60, but it wouldn't be. That would come out as a fail because of the other rule that they need to hit everything at met in order to pass. So although that apprentice has got more than 60% overall, one of the learning outcomes was only partially met, therefore they cannot pass that method and they would need to resit or retake it. And in the next example, again, if we look at the consultative project, this particular apprentice has decided that they're going to carry 3 learning outcomes over into the professional discussion. The independent assessors marked the project. They've said there aren't any learning outcomes that are not met. There aren't any learning outcomes that are partially met. There are 7 learning outcomes that were met, and there were 10 learning outcomes that were exceeded. So when they put all of that into the grading table, it'll automatically work out the percentage for them, and it comes out at 84%. So that's just shy of the 85% needed to get a distinction. So that apprentice would pass that method. And to simplify that from the apprentice's point of view, they've met the pass criteria. they've exceeded 10 learning outcomes. But in that table that we just looked at, it made it really clear that to get a distinction for this method, you need to exceed 11 learning outcomes. Okay. So the apprentices carried 3 over, which means that they essentially, to get a distinction, need to hit the pass criteria and exceed 11 learning outcomes. This apprentice has hit the pass criteria, but they've only exceeded 10 learning outcomes. So their overall grade for that method would be a pass rather than a distinction. So there are a couple of questions, I think, in the Q&A. So I'll just have a quick look at those now and see if it's something we can answer. How often do you see learners carry over learning outcomes to the professional discussion? One for Kayleigh, I think.
Quite often, to be honest, it can be quite common. It does kind of depend on what project the apprentice is doing. You know, they might have an absolutely great project, but just have no way of demonstrating 1 or 2 learning outcomes, so they choose to carry them over. I hope we've made clear that, you know, apprentices won't be penalised at all. There'll be no negative impacts of carrying learning outcomes over. It's essentially just about when looking at that project plan, when doing that RAG rating on those learning outcomes, you know, and because all learning outcomes do need to be met at a minimum of 3, it's what is going to give that apprentice the best chance. So is it better to try and demonstrate this through the consultative project, or is it better to carry that over and have a go at that in the professional discussion?
Thanks, Kayleigh. And then one other question, is a matrix still used to indicate where in the project the outcomes are within the project?
There is, yeah. So there is still a referencing table to be completed. It is very, very similar to the one that we're kind of using at the minute in the previous version. It has been simplified though, because we're aware that in the last one, it was a macro-enabled document that a lot of people have issues with. So format-wise, it has been simplified a lot, but kind of looks-wise, it does look quite similar to the old one.
Thanks, Kayleigh. And then another question, have the learning outcomes changed? So
the past learning outcomes haven't changed, but we have basically looked a lot at the amplification for those learning outcomes, just to make sure there's absolute clarity on what is required to meet those at a pass. We've also then added in additional amplification as well to show what evidence is required for the apprentice to exceed that outcome. And we do have the map and amplification document that will show the learning outcome, evidence required to meet the outcome, and evidence required to exceed that outcome.
Great, thanks, Kayleigh. That's all the questions for now. So we'll move on to the next section. But like I said, we're happy to cover any at the end, and any if you think later on I'm not quite sure about that, or there's something I didn't want to ask in this forum, give us a shout. Okay.
So for this slide, we just wanted to show you the assessment record because we have made a few changes to that. So previously, feedback was received on the actual project plan document, but we thought it might be better just to have everything in one place for you. So as you can see on there is space for IEPA comments. So that feedback will be in line with what you're receiving on your project plans at the minute. There'll also be confirmation on there for any learning outcomes that the apprentice wishes to carry over to the professional discussion. So we've included that on there because once the apprentice has said in their project plan that they are carrying over any learning outcomes, they're not able to change that. So if an apprentice has said in their project plan that they are carrying over 1 learning outcome, in carrying out their project, if they're then able to demonstrate that, unfortunately, we're not able to count it, it would need to be carried over to the professional discussion. So we've just put that in there just to kind of clarify these are the ones that are being carried over. I've then just put in a screenshot as well for feedback that you'll be receiving for the consultative project. So in there, there'll be any learning outcomes that were either not met or learning outcomes achieved at an exceeded level. So the endpoint assessor will amend that box depending on if the apprentice has achieved a fail or a passing distinction. So if the apprentice does achieve a fail in their consultative project, we will then detail which learning outcomes were not met, so you know which ones to target in the reset. However, if the apprentice has got a pass or distinction, we will detail in there the learning outcomes that have been achieved at an exceeded level. There's then space in there for summative feedback, and that'll be in line with what's being received at the moment. We've then got that score, which will be shown as a percentage, just so that's comparable across different apprentices. So that score should also as well demonstrate if the apprentice passed, how well of a pass was that, and sort of how close was that to a distinction. And then obviously the grade for that assessment method of a fail, a pass, or a distinction. And that'll also look very similar as well for the professional discussion.
Thanks, Kayleigh. A question just come through. So will that include the partially met learning outcomes?
It will do, yeah. Yeah, they'll also be detailed on there.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I believe that actually brings us to the end of the session. So we've got loads of time for questions. I doubt we're going to have an hour's worth. But if there are any questions that you've got that we haven't answered yet, pop them in the chat now. We'll wait a minute or so. If not, then obviously, like I said, you'll get a copy of the slide deck emailed to you and a copy of the recording, and you know our details. So if you've got any subsequent questions, please do kind of reach out, get in touch. Indeed, any feedback that you've got when you're delivering this, it's really useful for us. So we kind of refine the approach after it's been rolled out, and tweak it, make sure it works for everybody. So a question coming in, when is the new paperwork available?
So it is available now for both level 3 and level 5. That's available to download from the support materials section of EPA Pro.
Thank you. Another question. So with changes around approach to CIPD modules, will you still require a copy of the CIPD certificate at Gateway?
We do, yes, for level 5 HR consultant partner, not to be confused with the new assessment plan that's been released for what will now be called people professional. So that's the new assessment plan, and HR consultant partner has been renamed. We are currently working on our assessment approach and our grading approach for people professional. There are some changes in relation to that professional qualification, and we are planning a webinar, we're hoping, for early next year, where we'll be able to give an overview of what to expect for that one.
Thanks, Kayleigh. Just to add to that, actually, on the new people professional, obviously it's a little bit more complicated now because it'll have the qualification embedded within the endpoint assessment. So what we've done this time around is we are proactively standardizing with a number of endpoint assessment organizations just to make sure we've got a consistent approach to it. So it's equitable for all apprentices and employers and training providers. So hopefully that'll mean that we won't be in a position where we roll it out and then subsequently, have to do standardization activities and things like that, because we'll be doing that up front. We've kind of all got together and agreed that that's the best thing to do and the right thing to do for our customers and apprentices. So another question there, if somebody is already in Gateway, will they continue on the previous grading style?
They will do, yeah. So for HR level 5, the changes that we've been through today, that will impact apprentices who come through Gateway on or after the 1st of January 2024. And for HR level 3, it'll be apprentices who come through Gateway on or after the 1st of March 2024. If you do want apprentices to be assessed against this version and they're coming through Gateway before that date, that's absolutely fine. You just need to make sure that you're using the correct paperwork that's in the latest version of the toolkit.
Thanks, Kayleigh. I think that's the end of the questions. So I'll just say thank you very much, Kayleigh, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thanks for engaging and contributing and asking questions. And like I say, please do give us any subsequent questions you've got and give us any feedback from yourselves or apprentices or the employers that you work with, just so we can make sure that we've got this right and it works as effectively as it can for everybody. So thank you very much and have an excellent day. Take care.